1,000 doctors failed to save his son, but a poor, black-skinned maid held the power to heal him instantly. In a world ruled by blood, fear, and betrayal, she became his salvation, and the one who would awaken a darkness in his heart he never knew existed. As enemies close in, secrets unravel, and love ignites amidst chaos, can a ruthless mafia boss and a courageous maid survive the storms of passion, danger, and vengeance together? Hi everyone, I'm Selena James. Before we dive into today's journey, make sure to hit subscribe and show your support, just like you've always supported Mr. James. Your love and encouragement mean the world, and I can't wait to share this adventure with you. The city was silent, almost as if it held its breath for him. Inside the massive, darkened mansion, a different kind of tension hummed through the air, one that even the strongest men of the Mafia could feel in their bones. At the center of it all sat Adrian Moretti, the man everyone whispered about in fear, feared, respected, ruthless, a kingpin whose name could make enemies vanish overnight. Yet tonight, there was a shadow over his heart that no one dared to see. His young son, Luca, lay in the grand bedroom, pale and fragile, his tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The finest doctors from around the world had been summoned, over 1,000 minds, over 1,000 diagnoses, and not a single one had saved him. Each failure had driven Adrian closer to a darkness even he had never known, a desperation that made his fists shake and his teeth grind. Every tick of the clock was a stab through his soul, a reminder that even power could not conquer all. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, luxury, and fear. Nurses hovered nervously at the edges, whispering frantic updates. Doctors argued quietly, their words blending into a cacophony that grated on Adrian's nerves. He had no patience for incompetence, but tonight, not even his fury could find an outlet. He clenched his jaw and looked at his son, feeling helpless in a way he never had before. The entire world, with all its riches, all its influence, had failed him. And yet, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, timid, almost hesitant. Adrian's sharp gaze snapped to the figure that entered the room. She was a young woman, small and humble, her brown skin glowing faintly under the cold light. Her clothes were plain, a simple maid's uniform that contrasted sharply with the opulence surrounding her. There was something about her presence that made the room still, not in fear, but in a peculiar calm that felt almost sacred. She moved with quiet confidence, her eyes not on him, but on the boy lying so still. "Who are you?" Adrian's voice was low, a growl that carried both suspicion and warning. No one entered his domain without his permission, and yet here she was. The doctors looked at him nervously, unsure whether to intervene, while the nurses whispered among themselves, awe and curiosity mingling in their tones. I can help him," the maid said softly, her voice steady despite the tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. "Please, let me try." Adrian's fists tightened at his sides. He was a man who believed in power, in control, in the dominance that fear could command, and yet a strange, inexplicable pull urged him to step aside. Something about her, the calm authority in her touch, the certainty in her gaze, was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The boy's tiny hand twitched slightly as she approached, and she reached out with gentle hands. There was no ceremony, no theatrics. She simply laid her fingers over his chest, eyes closing for a brief moment, as if listening to something only she could hear. The room held its breath. The doctors leaned forward, incredulous, watching as the impossible began to happen. Color returned to Luca's cheeks, his shallow breaths deepened, and warmth spread through his tiny body as if life itself had been poured back into him. Adrian could hardly believe his eyes. One moment his son had been at death's door, the next he was pink, vibrant, moving with a strength that seemed impossible. The maid opened her eyes and looked at him, unafraid, calm, almost luminous in her serenity. The room erupted into whispered exclamations, doctors exchanging astonished glances, nurses gasping in relief, but Adrian only saw her, The boy's life had been restored in minutes by the hands of someone he could not yet understand. What? Oh, are you really? Adrian's voice broke slightly, a mixture of awe, suspicion, and something deeper, something he hadn't expected to feel. Fear of losing his son had always driven him, but now it was mingled with a dangerous curiosity about this girl who had dared to enter his world and alter it forever. The maid bowed her head slightly, a soft, knowing smile playing on her lips. She said nothing, but her calm presence seemed to fill the room, leaving everyone else unsure whether to marvel or to fear. Even Adrian, the king of his shadowed empire, felt a twinge of vulnerability he had never known. Outside the bedroom, the night was still, but inside, the air crackled with tension, wonder, and a strange, unspoken promise. The boy was alive. The impossible had been achieved, and yet a storm of questions now loomed over the mansion. Questions about power, about fate, about the young maid who had suddenly become the center of a world she had never asked to enter. Adrian's eyes never left her face. He did not know if he should be grateful or wary, if he should trust her or fear her. But one thing was certain: her arrival had changed everything. And in the silence that followed, one thought burned in his mind, sharp and relentless. She was not ordinary. She was something extraordinary. The maid straightened, brushing invisible dust from her uniform, and for the first time, Adrian noticed the depth in her eyes, a mixture of strength, secrets, and a quiet defiance that dared him to challenge her. The room, once tense with desperation, now hummed with a different energy, one that neither fear nor wealth could control. And then, just as he opened his mouth to speak again, the maid's gaze shifted toward Luca, and she whispered softly, almost to herself, "You're safe now. I'll protect you." Adrian's chest tightened. Protect him? From what? Or from whom? He didn't know yet, but he would find out. And whatever came next, he realized that his life, his world, and his heart were already being pulled into something far more dangerous and far more thrilling than he had ever imagined. Jned. The night stretched on, silent except for the soft, even breathing of the boy. But Adrian's mind raced, thoughts colliding with suspicion, awe, and a strange, unbidden curiosity. Who was she? How had she done it? And most importantly, what did her arrival mean for him, for his son, for the empire he ruled with iron and fire? The answers were unknown, but one thing was certain: nothing in his life would ever be the same again. And as he stared at the young maid who had healed his son, a single, dangerous thought crossed his mind. This girl was not just a miracle. She was a storm waiting to break. Adrian could not sleep. The mansion, usually alive with whispers of power and the quiet hum of loyalty, seemed empty, yet every shadow felt alive with secrets. He walked the long corridors, his mind replaying the events of the night. The boy was safe, yes, but that young maid, her presence gnawed at him. There was something about her calm confidence, her certainty, that he couldn't ignore. Her gift, her power, whatever it was, had unsettled him in ways no rival, no betrayal, no amount of fear ever had. He called his most trusted men quietly, speaking in low tones, their footsteps silent against the marble floors. Find everything about her, every detail, family, past, any hint of who she really is. I want it all, he commanded, voice sharp but controlled. The men nodded, accustomed to his demands, and vanished into the night, leaving him alone with the echo of his own thoughts. Meanwhile, the maid, Nia, returned to her quarters, the small, sparse room feeling impossibly quiet after the chaos of the evening. She had expected gratitude, perhaps even curiosity, but instead she found herself under a weight she had not anticipated, eyes watching her, whispers that seemed to follow her even in silence. She had only wanted to save the boy, nothing more. Yet now, in the Opal, a mansion filled with wealth and danger, she felt exposed, vulnerable, and oddly trapped. Rumors began spreading almost immediately. Among the staff, whispered accounts of the miracle circulated. Nurses and junior doctors spoke of her as though she were something supernatural, something otherworldly. Even the rival gangs caught wind of it. Information traveled fast in Adrian's world, and news of a girl who had healed the Mafia boss's son reached ears that would never forget an opportunity to exploit weakness. Nia tried to focus on her duties, cleaning, serving, moving through the mansion with silent precision. But each glance over her shoulder reminded her that she had entered a world she did not understand. Every shadow could hide danger, every footstep could signal a threat, and she was alone, except for the boy she had saved, and the man who now regarded her with suspicion and intrigue. Adrian spent hours poring over what his men had gathered. Her name, a brief history, a simple background. Nothing to suggest anything extraordinary, nothing to explain her gift. Yet, his instincts screamed at him that she was hiding something. There was intelligence in her eyes, a strength that defied her humble origins. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, feeling both irritation and fascination intertwine. How could someone so small, so unassuming, wield a power that defied reason? The following day, Nia moved quietly through the mansion, yet the tension seemed tangible. Servants whispered behind closed doors, and even some of Adrian's trusted men gave her cautious looks. She was aware of it, yet she tried to remain calm. The boy needed care, and she would not let him suffer, not when she had the chance to protect him. But the world she had stepped into was unforgiving, and each day brought her closer to dangers she could scarcely imagine. Late in the evening, a folded note appeared on her bedside table. No signature, no indication of who had left it, but the message was unmistakable. You know too much. Either you do as you are told, or the boy suffers. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the words. She had anticipated suspicion, perhaps curiosity, but not blackmail, not threats aimed directly at her for saving a life. Fear crept into her chest, a cold, heavy weight that she had not felt in years. She thought of Adrian, of the way he had watched her with those piercing eyes. The suspicion in his gaze had shifted slightly, softened by gratitude, but still, there was wariness. She could not turn to him with the note. She knew better than to invite the attention of a man like Adrian without caution. Yet she also understood that she could not ignore it. The threat was real. The boy's life, and perhaps even her own, hung in the balance. Adrian, unaware that she had received a message, continued his investigation. He moved through the mansion like a shadow, questioning servants, reviewing reports, piecing together fragments of her past. Every small revelation seemed to raise more questions than answers. Who had trained her? Where had she learned her abilities? And why had she chosen to step into his world when she had every reason to stay hidden? Rumors outside the mansion began to swirl as well. Rival gangs, desperate to undermine Adrian's power, whispered tales of a girl with healing hands, a miracle worker whose presence could tip the balance of loyalty. Letters were sent, eyes were dispatched to observe, and threats were quietly communicated to those bold enough to speak. Nia had unknowingly become a target, a pawn in a game far larger than she could see. She spent the next days moving carefully, maintaining her duties while keeping a constant vigilance. Every unexpected knock, every sudden shadow made her heart race. She could not fail, not now, not when the stakes were higher than they had ever been. And yet, despite the fear, a quiet resolve began to grow within her. She had saved the boy once, and she could do it again. She would not let threats dictate her actions. Adrian watched her from a distance, keenly aware of her every movement. Her quiet strength, the way she handled herself, intrigued him even, more than it unnerved him. He had dealt with power, with violence, with cunning, but something about Nia's composure, her defiance in the face of danger, made him pause in ways he had never paused before. He realized that her world and his were colliding, and the collision would not be gentle. And then, just when it seemed she had navigated the treacherous days without incident, the blackmailer struck again. A sealed envelope appeared in the hallway, addressed to her in careful, deliberate handwriting. Inside, more than threats, more than fear, it contained proof that someone had been watching her, tracking her movements, learning her secrets. The words inside were cold and calculated. You belong to this world now. The boy is only the beginning. Obey or suffer the consequences. Nia's hands shook as she held the envelope. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the danger was no longer abstract. The stakes were no longer merely her life, but the boy she had sworn to protect. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide, yet she could not. Adrian's empire, his protection, the fragile safety of the boy, all depended on her courage, her cleverness, and perhaps the unknown gift that had brought her here. Adrian finally learned of the threat, piecing together the hints that reached his ears. His face hardened, the storm behind his eyes deepening. No one threatened his son and lived to speak of it. Yet even as anger surged within him, a grudging respect grew for the maid who had become the focal point of both his protection and his curiosity. She was clever, brave, and perhaps more dangerous than he realized. That night, the mansion felt alive with tension. Every hallway seemed to echo with whispers of danger. Every shadow seemed to carry the threat of unseen eyes. Nia moved quietly, alert, aware that the blackmailer could strike at any moment. She had crossed a line she could not return from. Her life was now intertwined with forces beyond her comprehension. And as she paused by the boy's room, watching him sleep peacefully, a quiet determination settled in her chest. She would protect him, no matter the cost. Adrian's gaze lingered on her from the shadows, sharp and unreadable. The storm of suspicion, intrigue, and curiosity between them was only beginning. He had questions, doubts, and an uneasy admiration he could not name, and she, Nia, knew that in this dangerous game, trust was scarce, and betrayal could come from any direction. The mansion slept uneasily that night, the quiet punctuated only by the soft rustle of curtains and the distant city hum. Outside, enemies stirred, observing, plotting, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Inside, Nia pressed the letter to her chest, feeling the weight of the world pressing down. She was small, alone, and untrained for the wars of men like Adrian, yet she had a fire within her that refused to be extinguished. And then, as midnight approached, the first real test came. A shadow moved along the walls, silent, deliberate. Nia sensed it before she saw it. The blackmailer had made his first move beyond threats. The mansion, the boy, and her life were now in immediate danger. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew the storm was coming, and she had no choice but to face it head on. The message was clear and chillingly intimate. Someone knew her every step, every secret, every weakness. The world she had entered was not forgiving. The boy's life was no longer the only prize. Her own safety, and perhaps even Adrian's patience, hung by a thread. The danger was real, the stakes were high, and the next move would define everything. Nia tightened her grip, her knuckles white against the envelope. She was terrified, but she would not let fear control her. The blackmailer thought he had leverage, thought he could bend her to his will, but he had underestimated her courage. And somewhere in the darkness, Adrian watched, calculating, protective, and aware that the young maid he barely understood was now the center of a web of danger and intrigue that could consume them all. The night stretched on, silent but charged with electricity. Every heartbeat, every shadow, every whisper was a reminder that nothing would ever be the same. And just as she prepared to act, to defend the boy, to face whatever threat loomed, another envelope slid beneath her door. The handwriting was different this time, more precise, more threatening, and this one contained a simple, terrifying sentence. The boy's life is mine. Fail, and he dies. Nia's pulse raced. She looked at the sleeping child, a fierce resolve settling in her chest. The world outside was full of danger, yes, but she would not let him fall. She would fight, she would endure, She would survive, and in the shadows, Adrian's eyes burned with a promise he could not yet voice. No one would harm what was his. No one would. The game had begun. The mansion felt alive in a way that made Adrian's skin prickle. Every shadow, every echo of his own footsteps seemed heavier tonight, charged with an invisible threat. The envelopes, the letters, the whispered warnings, they were no longer abstract. Someone wanted the boy, and now it was no longer a game of words. It had moved to action. Adrian's eyes swept over the mansion from his private office, the skyline outside a darkened blur, reflecting the storm inside his mind. He had always faced threats head-on, but this one gnawed differently at him. It involved a child. It involved her, the maid who had appeared out of nowhere and healed his son with hands that seemed touched by fate. He had spent years building an empire with fire and fear, and yet he realized that no weapon in his arsenal could replace vigilance when it came to her safety. He called his closest men into the office, his voice sharp and precise, leaving no room for error. The boy and the maid are off limb. You move like shadows. No one enters without my orders, and anyone who steps out of line disappears without a trace. Do you understand? The men nodded, knowing the storm behind his words was not one to be tested. Nia, meanwhile, felt the air shift. The quiet had been deceptive, the tension almost imperceptible to others, but she had learned to sense it in instinct. The blackmailer was bold, clever, and dangerous, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he or his men made a move. Her small hands clenched at her sides as she moved through the mansion, every step deliberate, every glance careful. It came sooner than she expected. A shadow detached itself from the hallway just as she passed, moving with a precision that suggested lethal intent. The first of the rival gang had arrived. Their faces were hidden beneath masks, their hands glinting with knives, guns, the tools of men who did not hesitate. Nia's heart hammered in her chest, but she did not panic. She had survived this long by keeping her wits sharp, and she would not fail now. Adrian, sensing the intrusion before it even happened, emerged from the shadows himself. His presence alone was enough to make most men hesitate, but these were not ordinary men. They had been sent by those who believed they could test the Mafia boss. They were wrong. With a speed that belied his size, he moved like a predator, intercepting the first assailant with a brutal, calculated strike. The sound of bone cracking under his hand echoed through the hallway, followed by the sharp exhale of a man who had underestimated him. Nia did not wait. Instinctively, she ducked behind a pillar, using the environment around her to her advantage. She had learned that survival often depended on more than brute force. It depended on observation, timing, and clever tactics. She picked up a loose object from the floor, a small vase, and hurled it with precision. The object struck an attacker in the temple, sending him sprawling, unconscious before he could react. The room became a battlefield, shadows moving, metal clashing, the tension palpable. Adrian's brutality was methodical, efficient. Every strike, every motion showed the terrifying skill of a man who had lived in violence all his life. Yet even in the chaos, his eyes never left Nia. She moved with cunning and courage, dodging, defending, striking with ingenuity that impressed him despite the danger. For a moment, he allowed himself a grim satisfaction. She was not only brave, but capable. She could survive in a world designed to destroy the unprepared. The fight escalated. A man lunged at Nia with a knife, and she twisted just in time, rolling over a marble floor and coming up behind him, elbowing him sharply in the ribs. He grunted and fell, dazed. Another approached, gun raised, but Adrian was already there, disarming him in a motion so fast it seemed almost supernatural. Blood, sweat, and fear mingled in the confined hallway, the air thick with the smell of tension and danger. Somewhere in the chaos, Nia's mind raced. She knew that her skill, her instinct, was her greatest weapon. She dodged another swing, using the opponent's momentum against him, knocking him into a wall. She did not hesitate, did not second-guess herself. Survival demanded action, and she was willing to do whatever it took. Adrian's eyes narrowed as he assessed the scene. Each movement of hers, each tactical decision drew his attention. He had seen many fight, many die, many struggle, but she was different. She moved not with recklessness, but with intelligence, with strategy. And yet, despite her ability, he could feel the danger closing in. Their enemies were persistent, trained, and desperate. The last of the intruders lunged at Nia simultaneously. She rolled, kicked, and grabbed a piece of broken furniture, swinging it with precision that sent the attackers reeling. Adrian intercepted one, his hand crushing the gun as he threw the man aside. The hall was littered with bodies, moans of pain, and the metallic smell of adrenaline. The confrontation was short, brutal, and decisive. By the time silence returned, Nia stood with her chest heaving, hair disheveled but eyes blazing with determination. Adrian stepped closer, his presence dark and commanding. His voice, low and dangerous, cut through the lingering tension. "You're not helpless," he said almost to himself, but loud enough for her to hear. The acknowledgement was not comforting, not gentle. It was a recognition of her skill, of her resilience, of the fact that she had faced death and survived it. Nia met his gaze, defiant and steady. She did not seek praise, nor did she ask for protection. Yet the truth was clear. Adrian would not allow her to face such threats alone. She was caught between worlds now, the humble life she had known and the dangerous, shadowed reality of his empire. And she understood that survival required both courage and caution. When the attackers finally retreated, vanishing into the night as quickly as they had arrived, the mansion seemed eerily quiet. The echoes of the fight lingered, and so did the tension. Nia's hands were trembling slightly, her heart still racing, but she had survived. She had proven, to herself and to Adrian, that she could endure the violence that surrounded them. Yet, as the adrenaline faded, another reality settled in. Someone had orchestrated this attack. Someone had sent these men with intent, with planning, with a cold, calculated desire to harm her and the boy. The blackmailer was no longer merely a distant threat. He had moved into action. Later that night, a folded piece of paper appeared on the floor near her quarters. Nia picked it up, heart hammering, and unfolded it carefully. The words were simple, precise, and deadly. "Give me control of the boy, or die." There was no signature, no name, only the stark reality of the ultimatum. The message left no room for negotiation, no space for hesitation. Nia pressed the note to her chest, her mind racing. The fight had been a warning, a demonstration of the danger she faced. Survival alone would not be enough. Protection, cunning, and alliances would be necessary if she was to navigate this treacherous world. And she understood, with a cold certainty, that the blackmailer would not wait, would not falter, would not relent. Adrian, standing silently at the edge of the hallway, had seen her read the note. His expression darkened, his eyes narrowing into the dangerous storm of a man who would not allow threats to go unanswered. He did not speak immediately. He never wasted words when action was required. The boy, the maid, and the empire he commanded were intertwined now, and he was prepared to unleash the full force of his wrath to protect both. Nia's gaze met his, unflinching, despite the fear that clawed at her chest. She had survived the fight, had proven her resilience, had survived the chaos, but the ultimatum reminded her that this was only the beginning. The blackmailer's reach, his cunning, and his willingness to threaten life itself were a danger unlike any she had faced. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, the silence heavy with anticipation. Outside, the city slept unaware of the storm gathering within these walls. Shadows moved, whispers lingered, and every step, every heartbeat carried the weight of imminent danger. Nia tucked the note carefully into her uniform, her hands steady despite the racing of her pulse. She had no choice but to confront this threat, to defend the boy she had sworn to protect, and to face the darkness that had entered her life. And somewhere deep within her, a spark of resolve burned brighter than fear. She would survive. She would endure. She would fight. Adrian's presence remained near, silent but unyielding, a shadow of protection and warning. His trust was measured, his attention precise, and yet, beneath the surface, a dark admiration for her courage began to form. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside, and both of them knew that the game had escalated beyond words, beyond threats, into a battle where survival would be determined by skill, intelligence, and the will to endure. The night stretched on, tense and unbroken. The echoes of the fight still lingered in their ears, and the threat of the blackmailer loomed like a blade over their heads. Nia's determination did not waver, nor did Adrian's resolve. Both understood, in different ways, that the world they had entered was ruthless, unforgiving, and deadly, but also bound by a strange, inescapable link that would draw them together in ways neither could yet comprehend. The final thought that settled over Nia as she watched the sleeping boy was simple, yet powerful. No matter the danger, no matter the cost, she would not let him fall. And in the shadows, Adrian vowed silently the same. No one would harm what belonged to him. The first threat had come, but it had only hardened their resolve. The ultimatum remained, stark and chilling. Give me control of the boy, or die. The mansion never truly slept. Even in the dead of night, shadows lingered like living things, and the distant hum of the city seemed to pulse in rhythm with Adrian's heartbeat. He had spent the hours after the first attack moving through the halls, checking locks, reviewing security footage, and issuing quiet orders to his most trusted men. No one, he knew, would dare cross him without consequences. But now the threat was personal. It involved her, the maid, and the child he had sworn to protect. Adrian moved with silent precision, a shadow among shadows, as he inspected every corridor, every entrance, every window. His presence alone demanded obedience, his authority undisputed. He had built his empire on fear and loyalty, and he would wield both to protect what mattered most. Yet beneath the surface of his brutal exterior, a new awareness stirred. Nia, the young maid who had entered his life like a storm, had changed the rules. She was not simply someone to shield, she was someone he could not ignore, someone whose presence stirred an unfamiliar emotion within him. Nia, unaware of his constant vigilance, moved carefully through the mansion, tending to the boy with quiet diligence. Each task she performed was deliberate, precise, and laced with an undercurrent of tension. The boy's safety was her priority, yet the letters, the threats, the shadows of enemies outside made every step feel precarious. She had survived the first attack, but she understood that danger would not relent. Every movement required vigilance, every glance over her shoulder carried meaning. Adrian's men patrolled the perimeter, silent and lethal, but he knew that no amount of manpower could replace instinct, foresight, and the willingness to act without hesitation. He remained close to Nia, a silent protector whose presence was both reassuring and intimidating. He had never been accustomed to sharing control, yet here he was, forced to rely on her cleverness as much as his own brutal authority. The dark tension between them grew in subtle ways. A brush of hands as she passed him in a narrow hallway, a shared glance that lingered longer than necessary, moments that neither acknowledged, yet both felt deeply. Adrian's gaze followed her movements, noting her resilience, her courage, her intelligence. Each observation only deepened the magnetic pull he felt toward her, a pull that conflicted with his nature, his rules, and the danger that surrounded them. Nia noticed him too. His presence was commanding, suffocating in its intensity, yet she also saw glimpses of vulnerability, tiny cracks in his armor that he did not intend her to see. The way his jaw tightened when he worried about the boy, the slight hesitation before he spoke to her, the rare softness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. These moments unsettled her, made her heart race, and ignited feelings she did not yet understand. The following evening the mansion was quiet, but the tension was palpable. Nia prepared the boys' dinner with careful attention, moving through the kitchen with measured steps. Adrian stood nearby, silently observing, his presence a shadow that seemed to follow her even as she worked. Words were unnecessary. Both understood the unspoken agreement that had formed between them, protection, vigilance, and a fragile trust that neither could fully articulate. Their proximity sparked small, charged moments, a hand brushing against hers while handing the boy a glass of water, their eyes meeting across the room, the faint, unintentional touch of a shoulder as they navigated a narrow corridor. Each gesture was electric, unspoken, yet undeniable. The dark romance between them began to bloom in quiet, subtle ways, layered with tension, curiosity, and danger. But the threat outside had not diminished. Enemies watched, plotted, and waited for the perfect moment to strike again. Nia could feel it, the invisible eyes that tracked her movements, the sense of being hunted even in the relative safety of the mansion. She knew she could not ignore it. She had to remain alert, resourceful, and ready to act at a moment's notice. One night, as the wind howled outside and rain lashed against the windows, Adrian found her standing by the boy's bedside, gazing down at him with a quiet intensity. His presence in the doorway was silent, yet she felt it immediately, a weight that was both protective and demanding. He stepped closer, his voice low, barely more than a rumble. "He is safe, because of you." Nia's heart fluttered at the words, and she turned slightly to meet his gaze. There was an intensity there, a dark magnetism that made her pulse quicken. She did not respond with words, only a small nod, understanding the weight of his acknowledgement. She was not used to such attention, nor to such proximity. And yet, in that charged silence, a connection was forming. One built on danger, trust, and something far more complicated than either could name. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside the mansion. Thunder rattled the windows, lightning illuminating the dark halls in fleeting flashes. Nia's thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound at the window, a shadow that moved too deliberately, too carefully to be ignored. She felt the prickling sensation of being watched, of being targeted once again. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the bed, ready to act, ready to defend the boy and herself. Adrian noticed her tension immediately, stepping forward with silent authority. "Stay close," he commanded, his voice a low growl that carried both warning and reassurance. His hand brushed against hers as he guided her to the center of the room, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through both of them. Neither spoke of it, but the energy between them thickened, charged with unspoken desire and shared danger. Hours passed in tense vigilance. Nia could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her, the constant awareness of enemies lurking beyond the walls. Her mind raced with strategies, contingencies, and possibilities, but she also found herself increasingly aware of Adrian's presence, the protective force that loomed behind her, the unspoken bond that was forming in silence. In the early hours, she felt a sudden shift, a sense of movement, a presence she could not identify. Her instincts screamed at her, but before she could react, the room was empty. Adrian's gaze swept the hallway, and alarm sharpened his features. The maid was gone, disappeared, vanished. Panic surged through him, controlled but intense. He moved with precision, checking the corridors, the stairwells, the perimeter, every hidden passage he knew existed within the mansion. Then he found it, a clue, subtle but undeniable. Evidence that someone had targeted her, had taken steps to remove her from the safety of the mansion. Her disappearance was no accident. It was deliberate, calculated, and deeply personal. Adrian's mind raced, his instincts sharpened. He understood the stakes instantly. The boy, the maid, the empire he had built, all threatened in ways that demanded swift and brutal action. His eyes burned with a promise of vengeance, of protection, of control. No one would harm what was his, and no one would manipulate the maid he had come to rely on. Meanwhile, Nia's own mind was a whirlwind of fear, strategy, and determination. She had been careful, yet someone had outmaneuvered her. She knew the danger was immediate, the threat real, but she also knew she could not falter. The boy's safety depended on her, and she would not allow him or herself to be a pawn in someone else's game. As Adrian pieced together the evidence of her targeting, a dark thought consumed him. Someone had underestimated both her intelligence and his wrath. He would not allow that mistake to stand. His empire had been built on fear, on precision, on ruthless efficiency, and now he would unleash it with focus on protecting what mattered most. In the quiet that followed, the storm outside mirrored the storm within. The mansion, normally a fortress, now felt vulnerable, alive with unseen threats and invisible enemies. Adrian's eyes hardened, his mind racing with possibilities, strategies, and contingencies. He would find her, he would protect her, and he would make whoever dared to threaten them pay in ways they could never imagine. Nia, meanwhile, felt the weight of her predicament. She had faced danger before, but this was different. The dark corridors of the mansion, the unseen threats, the calculated moves of enemies, all required a careful mind, steady hands, and unwavering courage. She would not falter. She would survive. She would endure. And somewhere in the shadows, a silent observer noted every movement, every strategy, every fleeting glance between the Maid and the Mafia boss. The tension, the unspoken attraction, the dangerous connection. It was a storm waiting to break, one that promised fire, passion, and consequences far beyond either of their control. The night stretched on, charged with anticipation and fear. Naya disappeared into the darkness, and Adrian found the evidence of the targeting. The pieces were in motion, the players positioned, and the game had escalated beyond threats and ultimatums. The darkness of the world they had entered was real, and its reach was long, cold, and merciless. Yet even amidst the fear, the tension, and the danger, something deeper stirred between them. A connection, fragile but undeniable, bound them together in ways neither had anticipated. The dark romance had begun, woven into the fabric of peril and survival, and it would only grow stronger as the nights stretched on and the threats intensified. The chapter closed with the knowledge that nothing would be the same again. Nia's disappearance, the evidence of targeting, the looming danger. It was a promise of storms to come, of battles to be fought, of passions ignited in the shadow of violence. Adrian would not rest, and she would not yield. Together, whether they realized it or not, they had become a force that could not be ignored. Nia ran through the narrow alleys behind the mansion, the rain-slicked cobblestones glistening under the dim glow of street lamps. Her breaths came in sharp, controlled gasps, each one a reminder that survival depended on more than speed. It depended on wits, instinct, and the secrets she carried close to her chest. She could feel the danger closing in, the footsteps of those who had been sent to capture her echoing in the night. Every shadow seemed alive, every corner potentially hiding death. As she sprinted, fragments of her past flashed through her mind, memories she had buried for years. She was not born to wealth or privilege. Her childhood had been steeped in poverty, wandering streets and crowded homes, surviving on whatever scraps of food and kindness she could find. But even as a child, there had been something different about her. When someone was injured or ill, she instinctively knew how to help, how to heal. Others whispered of miracles she had performed in secret, but she never understood the depth of her gift, only that it was hers, inescapable and powerful. Then came the truth she had hidden from everyone. Her family, the people she had thought of as her own, were not strangers to danger. They were tied, by blood and loyalty, to a rival faction of the Mafia. She had fled that world, escaping the violence, betrayal, and expectations imposed upon her by those she barely recognized as kin. Her gift, her healing, had become her shield and her weapon, allowing her to carve out a small space of life and freedom. Until now, she had never imagined her path would collide so violently with Adrian Moretti, the most feared man in the city. The sounds of pursuit drew her back to the present. A man lunged from a side street, dagger glinting in the pale light. She ducked instinctively, rolling behind a stack of crates, her hands steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Using a broken metal pipe she found nearby, she struck him with precision, the sound of impact echoing off the walls. He collapsed, stunned, and she darted forward, weaving through alleys and side streets with the agility of someone who had survived far too many dangers in her life. Adrian, meanwhile, had pieced together the clues that revealed the direction she had taken. His eyes burned with fury and concern as he coordinated his men, tracking her movements with ruthless efficiency. He had always trusted his instincts, but tonight they screamed louder than ever. She was not just a pawn in his world, she was a force he could not ignore, someone whose survival mattered to him in ways he could not yet admit. Nia ducked into an abandoned warehouse, crouching behind rails as her pursuers closed in. She could feel the pressure mounting, the inevitability of confrontation pressing against her like a storm. Yet she did not falter. Her hands moved methodically, using every advantage, every shadow, every tool available. She had survived so much already. This was only another challenge, another test of her strength, courage, and intellect. The fight inside the warehouse was swift, brutal, and calculated. Men lunged, weapons raised, but Naya used their momentum against them. She twisted, dodged, struck with a combination of precision and instinctive skill that left her attackers staggering. It was not brute force that saved her. It was strategy, patience, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing herself and her abilities. As she paused, catching her breath, the reality of her situation pressed down. She could run, she could hide, but she could not remain here forever. Her connection to the rival family, the enemies watching every move, the letters, the threats, they all converged into a storm that would not relent. And yet, in the distance, she glimpsed a familiar shadow moving with lethal efficiency. Adrian had found her. Their eyes met across the dim, rain-streaked floor. He was silent, imposing, and yet there was a trace of something softer, admiration perhaps, for the courage she displayed, the skill she wielded. It was dangerous, reckless even, to feel anything resembling respect or attraction in the midst of chaos, but he could not help himself. She had survived where most would have fallen, outsmarted men trained to kill, and endured with a resilience that drew him in despite himself. Nia did not speak. She merely met his gaze, a mixture of defiance and relief in her expression. She had hoped he would understand her need for secrecy, her reasons for leaving her past behind, yet she knew trust was fragile, earned over time, not demanded. Every moment between them carried weight, their shared danger, their unspoken connection, and the undeniable tension that pulsed like electricity between them. As the rain continued to fall, washing the city in gray, a sudden noise alerted them both. Reinforcements, sent by those who wished to claim her as leverage, were approaching. Nia's pulse quickened. Adrian stepped forward, placing himself between her and the incoming threat. His presence was a barrier, a promise, and a warning to anyone foolish enough to continue the pursuit. Together they moved with fluid precision, navigating the warehouse with silent coordination. She led with clever maneuvers, he protected with lethal authority. Shadows clashed with shadows, and the sounds of struggle echoed off the walls, a chaotic symphony of violence, skill, and survival instinct. Naya's clever tactics combined with Adrian's brute efficiency created a dangerous, unstoppable force that their attackers could not anticipate. Eventually, the last pursuer fell, incapacitated, leaving them in the tense, echoing silence of the empty warehouse. Nia's breathing was heavy but controlled. Adrian's stance remained vigilant, his gaze sweeping the dark corners. Neither spoke immediately. Words were unnecessary. The danger had passed, for now. Adrian's eyes softened ever so slightly as he observed her. He admired her strength, her resilience, and her ingenuity. She had survived attacks, outmaneuvered men trained to kill, and maintained a composure that both infuriated and fascinated him. Yet beneath his admiration lingered a dark, pressing question. How much of her past could he trust? How deep did her secrets run, and what price would he pay if he allowed himself to trust her fully? Nia, feeling the weight of the moment, allowed herself a small exhale. She had survived, protected the boy, and proven herself capable. But she also knew the danger was far from over. The blackmailer, the rival families, the letters, they all promised that the threats were only growing more personal, more lethal, and more inescapable. Their shared gaze held for a long moment, silent acknowledgement passing between them. The bond between them, fragile yet undeniable, had grown stronger in the fire of danger. He had seen her strength. She had seen his protective ruthlessness, and together they had survived an ordeal that would have broken most others. But now came the real challenge: trust. Adrian had to decide whether to believe her when she revealed her past, when she told him the truth about her connections, her gift, and her intentions. To do so could place them both in peril, yet to ignore it risked losing her forever. The weight of the decision pressed upon him like a vice, and for the first time he felt the vulnerability that came from caring for someone beyond his own family, his own empire. Nia, meanwhile, felt the tension, the unspoken question hanging in the air. She had survived the physical threats, but now the emotional stakes loomed larger. Trust was dangerous, particularly with a man like Adrian, whose world was built on fear and control. Yet she also sensed the possibility, the glimmer of connection that promised something more than survival, perhaps even understanding, acceptance, and a fragile kind of safety. The night around them remained tense, shadows stretching long, rain pattering against the windows, and the city beyond pulsing with unseen threats. Both understood the stakes: survival, trust, and the fragile bond that had formed between them were now intertwined, delicate yet powerful. As they exited the warehouse into the dim, wet streets, the silence was broken by a single, chilling thought. The blackmailer would not relent. The danger was not over. And Adrian, facing the choice of trust or loss, felt the weight of the world settle on his shoulders. To trust her was to risk everything. To doubt her was to risk losing her forever. The night hung heavy, pregnant with tension, uncertainty, and the promise of storms yet to come. Adrian sat in the dim light of his office, the shadows of the room stretching long and jagged across the walls. His fingers drummed against the polished wood of his desk, sharp, controlled, and tense. The rain outside pounded against the windows like a warning, a reminder that the world he ruled was never quiet, never safe. Even in the calm of his private chambers, he could feel the pulse of danger, the stirrings of enemies, and the weight of power that never allowed him a moment's peace. The recent attacks on Nia and the boy gnawed at him, threading his mind with unease and anger. Every corner of his empire was mapped, controlled, monitored. But somehow they had reached her. They had crossed the line, touched something he had vowed to protect, and for that they would pay. His chest tightened as he imagined her in danger, her clever hands and fierce courage rendered useless if they fell into the wrong hands. She had survived against impossible odds, outmaneuvered men trained to kill, and yet, despite her skill, Adrian knew the world she had entered was unforgiving. He had fought countless wars, spilled oceans of blood, and faced betrayals that had left him hardened, unfeeling to most. But something about Nia stirred a raw, unrelenting protectiveness within him that he could not suppress. The night deepened, shadows crawling across the marble floors as he moved through the mansion. Each step was deliberate, every corner scanned for threats. He could feel the energy of his own empire around him, loyal men watching, waiting for instructions. Yet none could protect the boy or Nia with the personal intensity that he could muster. They belonged to him now, in ways that went beyond business or power. Suddenly, a sound from the hallway, a soft, deliberate shift, made him freeze. Nia stepped from the shadows, wet from the rain, hair clinging to her face. but her eyes bright with defiance. She had returned from an inspection of the perimeter, ensuring that no threat had slipped through, moving with the quiet, a confidence that had both impressed and infuriated him. He closed the distance between them with a predator's grace, and for the first time in moments of calm, the tension between them ignited,